Hey everyone, welcome back from the break. Thank you so much for everyone's understanding. I just want to take a moment out to talk about how much I care about the quality of the content at our conference. No one wants to sit in on, at a conference and just, be marketed products. So thank you everyone for understanding and why I had to pull our previous speaker off the stage. I don't think there was any malicious intent there. I think she just really didn't understand, what high bar that I'm setting for the quality of the content here at Apisecure. So with that being said, we have two very special speakers coming on stage now from a company called Approov. I promise there's no product pitches from them. I can personally vouch for them. Skip is a brilliant engineer and have had the honor of working with him in my former life. If many of you remember my mobile health hacking mobile health APIs research, where I hacked those, what was it, Skip, 30 mobile health APIs in like week, and then my research on hacking Fire APIs, all of which helped put me on the map. So I'll always hold a very special place in my heart for Approov and the folks over there. And I believe Ted is their new founder of the Feast over there as the new CEO. And so I'm super excited to have them on stage. I will let them introduce themselves. And I want all of you to enjoy this. I'm excited about the presentation. I've seen their deck, and I think they have a lot of really cool stuff to talk about. So enjoy, and I'll give the stage to you, Skip, and Ted.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Thanks, Alyssa. And yeah, I did want to just take a second to thank you for keeping the content non-promotional. And if Skip or I get out of line, we're going to get the hook. And those are the rules of the game. So. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to talk, Skip and I, about enhancing API security with runtime secrets and attestation. Quick background on who we are. Let's see if this works. Okay, so I'm the Chief Executive Officer. I just joined the company back in December. Prior to that, I spent 8 years in cybersecurity with a company called Silent. So this is my second cybersecurity rodeo and my, I think, fourth startup. So historically, I think Skip and I actually have a similar background. I started in defense electronics, doing RF and microwave design. Computer-aided engineering was the next step from there. Then I ended up at Cadence doing more general digital electronic design automation. Then started an EDA company, which was sold to National Instruments, now part of Cadence. And with that EDA company, we had a huge problem with software piracy. And that's where I really kind of started getting into the dark web and cybersecurity angle. So after we sold AWR, I started a company called Silent, and that was focused on essentially using telemetry to try to track down people who were cracking and hacking on-premise software, which logically led next to Approov. So here I am. And Skip, your background?
So I started off as a chip designer doing mixed signal design, so a mix of analog and digital. Worked my way kind of up the stack. Some of the interesting things I worked on were reconfigurable computing, where I was actually downloading hardware into an FPGA sort of on the fly. So in the middle of algorithms, switching in and out hardware. Kind of think of it as a hardware cache rather than a memory cache. I've always been interested in the split between hardware and software, did a bunch of projects on machine architectures and how to intelligently make trade-offs, find parallelism in algorithms, etc. And as we got closer to sort of a proven mobile API security, I was working on hardware acceleration for embedded devices and for cryptography type services that you might call from the web. That led us, the company Approov, into mobile and API security. We were sort of combining some projects we did in mobile with crypto. So here we are. It's been an interesting journey.
Okay. So in terms of what we're planning to cover today, we'll start off just with a brief overview of the mobile attack surfaces. Then we're going to get into hiding API secrets in the app, which no surprise, you're going to find out it doesn't really work. And then we're going to try to work on things that do work. So we're really going to talk about a couple techniques for protecting APIs. One around moving the secrets from the API itself off to the cloud, and another called Attestation, which a lot of you are probably familiar with. And then we'll go into next steps. So before we begin, we like to kind of just diagram out the playing field, or really the five, what we kind of call the 5 mobile attack surfaces. And having played a lot of sports, soccer and football, I sort of look at these attack surfaces a little bit like the defense on the field. You might have your nose tackle or your defensive line as your user credentials, but it's pretty easy to push that out of the way if it's easy to access, to get a user account or to buy one on the dark web. Your linebackers, at least in the mobile area, you have device integrity. Can you protect the device? Can you make sure it's clean? And can you protect the app from being modded or tampered with? So that's kind of backing up the user credentials. The next area that can be attacked is the API channel. So that's your defensive secondary or your center backs if you're playing soccer. And then, as you get to the API itself, you're really looking at the end zone. So the goal is to kind of use a variety of defense tactics and really kind of secure all areas of the field. Because if you're weak in any one space, that's where you're going to be attacked. And through this conference, we're seeing really, people attacking every area of the playing field. Mobile is an area that we specialize in. And one of the reasons why we think it's really important is that attackers really have an advantage, home field advantage, when they go after the mobile devices, because they can control a lot of the field in that they can control the device. They can jailbreak it, they can root it, they can emulate it, they can do a lot of things to make it easier to get into the end zone by controlling in the palm of their hands the application itself and the device itself. And the more reconnaissance you do, the more profitable the attack. Again, as we've seen time and time again throughout the conference, the data breaches are there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of data that's being exfiltrated, and a lot of damage that's being done, and it's very costly to the end users and to the vendors that are providing it. So, one of the areas that we look a lot at is the automotive area, and there's been a number of really good articles out recently on how pervasive hacking in the automotive sector is. It's not just automotive, but it's retail and fintech, and the applications themselves are not very well protected, as we're going to find out as we dive into the data. But these automotive apps, in addition to putting safety on the line, they also put financial risk on the line, because a lot of the automotive apps these days have credit card information for making payments and other things. And of course, as Alyssa pointed out with the fire piece that she did for us, I think the most valuable data on the dark web is healthcare data. People will pay the most for that because there's a lot of financial damage that can be done, and a lot of personal damage that can be done if that data is compromised. So how do you access it? I think it's pretty basic. Like one of your first 101 tactics in going after the API is static analysis. So you're just looking for high entropy strings. There's a number of open source and other tools that are out there. For example, the Mobile Security Framework, JADX, Andrew Guard. Keys can be constants. They are essentially just resources inside the NDK. And with very little effort, you can go in and find these kind of things. So one of the things that we did is we created an internal threat lab group, and we just recently published a report where we looked at the fintech applications. Essentially, we wanted to do a comprehensive search through the financial sector. So we started off by, I think we were probably too ambitious, Skip, in that we looked at the top 200 apps in 4 markets. So we downloaded it. It ended up being about 650 applications because some of them overlapped. But essentially what we did was we looked at the top 200 for the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And we got that data from Sensor Tower. We downloaded all the APKs, and then we just systematically performed static analysis on those. We used 3 open source tools or platforms for doing that. First step was to look at use an open source application called API key extractor, and we ran that to just basically look for the obvious keys that were lying in plain sight. And then we also looked at the Git repositories using Git leaks and Trufflehog to find additional basically high value secrets. Because we wanted to be systematic in how we did it, we categorized all the findings based on what the keys were for. So we basically broke them down into high value, medium value, and lower value secrets. We did that using keywords, and then we grouped all the results, and we built a comprehensive report where we looked at the data by type and by country. One of the things we were curious about was to see if there were differences between countries, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the headline story is really that 92% of the apps leaked profusely. In total, with the 650 apps that we looked at, only 5 of them were considered acceptable in that they exposed 0 secrets. 5 out of 650. 48 were considered very good because the secrets that were exposed were essentially things that were kind of lower value. It didn't look like anything that could be extremely damaging to a person. And then 150 were very high value, and the biggest bulk of secrets fell into what we kind of called a medium value secret bucket. And we can go into more detail on what we use to categorize those, or you can actually download the report if you're interested in reading it. But the big story was really the high value secrets, and we tried to focus on that. So 23% of the apps immediately revealed high value secrets. And then we broke it down by category. So in each of the countries, we looked at traditional banks. We looked at challenger banks or new banking, personal finance applications, trading and investing apps, payments and transfer, insurance, crypto, and then some of them just fell into another category. But no surprise here. I think the crypto apps were the most vulnerable when it came to high value secrets. So the move fast and break things attitude seemed to be more pervasive in the crypto apps, and that showed through in the data. And we'll dive more into the man in the middle and the man in the device attacks as we get through the presentation. But this was one of the ones that I found most interesting. If I had been asked to place a bet before looking at the data, where I thought there would be the most vulnerabilities, I would have bet on the US, and it certainly proved to be true. So on both ends of the spectrum here. So if we look at the ones where only low value or no secrets were leaked, less than 5% of the US apps made the cut. And in the area of high value secrets, 28%. So it was the worst of the worst in the bad, and had the lowest performing on the good criteria. And Germany, to no surprise, ended up being the best. Now, not head and shoulders over anybody else, but clearly there seems to be a little bit more of a mindset geared towards security in the German market. And I think I'm kind of proud that we got a couple of reference accounts from Germany, because they tend to be more security conscientious, and they performed best on both axes. and the France and the UK kind of fell somewhere in between the US and Germany. But again, nobody knocked the ball out of the park. Nobody really did particularly well in the study that we did. And that's not just true of the report that we published, but if you read reports from other vendors, they all find the same thing. So Alyssa did a report a couple of years ago on this very same topic. I think she did it in 2019. So here we are 4 years later, same exact problems, same exact tactics for extracting the reports. I think the difference today, though, is that I think the hackers are probably better at exploiting some of these things today than they were a few years ago. So then the other side of the coin is to look at them by the type of application. And you can see here, yeah, crypto leaked the most secrets, insurance and other were the least. And then the other thing that we did in the report was we looked at man in the device attacks. So again, coming back to those different areas, the different threat landscapes, where was the protection when it came to making sure the device was not tampered with? And again, very few of the apps performed well. There's not a single passing grade here, but as you would hope, the traditional banks did the best. I don't know if Silicon Valley Bank is included in these numbers or not, but the really kind of failing grades across the board. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to hand the mic to Skip to go through some of the things that we can do to better protect the apps and figure out where to hide them if you're going to hide them and how to defend yourself from really being found. Skip.
Thank you, Ted. And I'll go ahead and ask you to keep the slides going. So I just want to start off by saying, as far as APIs go, secrets obviously are very important to APIs, and it seems like it's relatively easy to lose a secret in a mobile application because of all the security challenges. So our goal here, or my goal today, is just sort of try and explain to you kind of where things are at and how we can evolve them to both hopefully improve the security on mobile devices, as well as if a secret is exposed or lost, kind of improve the nimbleness of your API security so that you can potentially change those secrets. So losing one is painful, but it's not as painful as it is today when you lose one and have to completely reissue a new application out into the marketplace. So we'll start here in this slide with a simple app connected to a backend API. There's an API gateway in the front doing some type of backend security. And I'm really going to focus here on Ted's 5 attack surface areas. The kind of core 3 for me are going to be the application security, the device security, and the channel between the application and the backend security. So a pretty typical start in a mobile application will be to go ahead and add some obfuscation into your application. So what we're doing here is trying to make those hard-coded secrets and some of the business logic as hard to follow as possible. If you're looking at open source tools, you can use Android's R8, and I'll focus on Android for this talk. You can use ProGuard, which has been around for a while, or you can use certainly commercial vendor approaches, which may offer more extended obfuscation techniques. You're trading here obscurity for runtime costs. So the harder it is to find the secrets, the more you turn the dials on obfuscation, the more it's potentially going to cost you in runtime or in energy usage as you make these things harder to find. The general rule of thumb is that if a secret is valuable enough, it will eventually be extracted. So obfuscation is a good start. It will slow down attackers, but it will not absolutely prevent attackers from breaking through again if the secret is valuable enough. Next slide, Ted. Next slide there. Great, thanks. So let's assume that you've turned the knobs up really high on obfuscation, and I'll do an initial static analysis. I might run a similar set of tools to what Ted has already talked about, and maybe I can't easily find the secret. So I'll pivot immediately into the runtime. So if I can't find it statically, can I actually observe the runtime execution and nab it at some point in the flow? And I have a lot of advantages here on mobile that I don't necessarily see on web, in that I own the device that is actually executing So I can go ahead and use, say, an older version of Android that may not have quite the same protection in it. I can run on emulators. And one of the things I can do, no matter how hard a secret it is, I can try and see if I can run it in a standard debugger. A typical Android app in production will have debugging turned off, but I might be able to just simply take your app and repackage it and make it so that it is open to debuggers. So the secret itself is going to be buried in the obfuscation somewhere, but if I simply run it up to what appears to me to be a known API call signature, using whatever network stack I detect is there, then I can go ahead and perhaps find that secret. So even if you sliced it up into 1,000 different places and spread it throughout your application, if I can catch it at the right point, it's very easy to find that secret. I can do a lot with this, but what I'm really trying, no, go ahead, that's fine. So next slide, there we go. So what I'm forced to do to defend against this sort of thing is to improve my runtime checking. So can I block actual running in debuggers and running in emulators? And the answer is yes, you can do that. Here, root beer is a pretty popular open source code that is going to detect whether a debugger is in place and running or not. It will require you to add more functionality into your app in order to do this. And attacks evolve over time. So can I figure out how to overcome this? And you get in sort of an arms race where the attacker will do something new and you will have to add some protection. And if you have to roll out a new app as a result, this can be quite painful. Next slide. So another approach which kind of builds on runtime checking in the Android world is Google's safety net, and also what's known today as play integrity. And this gives you a stronger and a good sort of anchor of basic techniques for doing runtime checking. They're done at a particular point in time. You will request to be attested, and the play integrity API will be called, and it will perform a number of checks trying to see if there is rooting in place or jailbreaking in iOS. And iOS, of course, has a similar attestation package called device check or App-attest. Has this package been tampered with in some way? Repackaging, for instance, what I talked about earlier to enable debuggers might be protected by this. So this is a pretty good start. It will, on Android, require that the environment that you're running in support Google Play services. That's not true of all markets around the world, but many of them, that's true. And sort of one of the foggy things about Android attestation here with the Google service is that they don't tell you how many times you can use it before they start limiting its use. So you have to justify the amount of volume you do, and if there's spikes in volume, you're probably going to run into problems. Additionally, it does take a bit of time. It's not the fastest operation to do. So the advice is typically that you request an attestation here to occur maybe before a critical API call, maybe when the device first launches, but you don't do it all that often. So that's a possible limitation to consider. Other more commercial attestation tools may run faster and therefore can be used more frequently. The interesting thing, though, if you look at this, when we were looking in the slide before about debuggers, root beer itself is just added into the application itself, and that's it. If you look at play integrity here, what you're seeing is that the request to do the integrity check is actually done on the application. So there's some machinery inside the application to do that. But the verdict, the actual evaluation of the attestation results, is done off service, or off application, I should say, in the separate service. So it's interesting to note that now for the first time, you're seeing sort of a split between where something is being measured and where something is being decided upon. Next slide. So let's assume that attestation is pretty good. So the runtime is getting a little bit harder to attack. As an attacker, I would immediately pivot into the channel, that third of the attack services I'm interested in. And here, by far, the popular attack approach is manipulator in the middle, formerly known as man in the middle, or if it's Alyssa is speaking, woman in the middle. And What we're really doing here is there is a TLS or an HTTPS channel between the application and your backend service. There's a handshake negotiation there where there's some passing certificates, and you're attempting to prove that you can trust the backend API service by evaluating the trust expressed in the certificate. Android and iOS have trust stores where there will be a common set of root certificates. And when the certificate is presented to the application, it asks the device trust store to check the trust. It will look at the certificate and walk up a set of chains of trust until it finds a root certificate that matches. So if you're attempting to do a man-in-the-middle type attack, the common approach would be to try and go ahead and pollute this device store. Now, you might not be able to do that as easily on newer versions of Android, but you can do that pretty easily on older versions. So if I was attacking, I'd be running your application on an older Android device, so I could do this very easily. So once I have this in place, I can present a phony certificate that says, I am your API service. And when it goes ahead and looks in the device store, it will find that, oh, lo and behold, there is trust there. So this should be good to go. And at this point, I can now break the decryption or encryption in TLS and go ahead and watch all your API calls, extract secrets, not just your API key, but user authentication secrets. I can very easily reverse engineer your API because I'm seeing all the calls, all the responses. I can even get in the middle and manipulate these call sequences. Say I was trying to watch deposits into a bank. I could skim a penny or two off each transaction if I wanted to attempt something like that. So very popular approach. And the defense in this case is to go ahead and say, I don't really trust that trust store. It's too easy to compromise that. Instead, for my application itself, I'm expecting it to talk to a particular API service. And I'm going to go ahead and pin an API certificate key. I'll typically hash the public key of your certificate and place that into sort of the application trust store, if you will. And therefore, I am not going to fall prey to some man in the middle who has put something into the device trust store. I am only going to recognize the certificate coming from your legitimate backend API service. So this is sort of yet another secret. It's not that important if it's exposed, if you can see it, but what's really important is that you not be able to modify it inside the app. Next slide. So of course, the attacker is going to work real hard to figure out how to bypass certificate pinning. So he can go ahead and remove that problem. And there are instrumentation frameworks such as Frida, for example, very popular to use on Android, and Objection, which wraps Frida and makes it even easier to specifically bypass certificate pinning. What these are doing is they're sitting outside the application in the runtime, and they're attempting to identify certain function calls within your apps, hook them, and replace them with their own. So where the application is saying, does this hash match the certificate that's being presented, then Objection would go in and hook that call and say, oh yes, it absolutely is, please continue. And that's very easy for an attacker to do. And with obfuscation, you're making it a little bit harder. I might need to hunt around for function calls to figure out which networking stack you're using, provide a little more insight into Objection, and I can go ahead and unhook your certificate pinning and continue on my way. So there's a continual back and forth here. Can I detect something like Frida in the runtime or not that goes forward? Next slide, Ted. So two other things I just want to touch on as interesting techniques that are used somewhat in mobile defense. One is called trust on first use, or TOFU. So in this case, on first launch, the app itself is going to request some primary secrets or a primary sort of perhaps a decryption key, some piece that will allow me to unlock secrets on a device. The interesting thing about this is that I no longer have to have those secrets sitting in my code. So they're immediately downloaded with the application itself. So they're no longer necessarily need to be static secrets, but I'm only doing this on first launch of the app. And it requires a lot of trust that that first launch of the app is not being detected or monitored in any way, for example, by man in the middle. Next slide. Another technique which is interesting to me is looking again at the channel. If I'm going to assume that man in the middle is going to be there and I, let's say, can't stop it, what other things could I do to harden this channel back to the API calls? One thing to do is, rather than providing an API key directly across the wire, I could instead go ahead and use that API key to sign a short-lived JWT, JSON Web Token. And in that case, as I'm making the API call, the token itself would go across the channel, and it's possible that a man-in-the-middle attack could extract that token. But at least they have not extracted the secret itself. In this case, they've extracted a token which can be used until its lifetime expires. And this just requires some modifications to your backend. Rather than looking at the key itself, you're going to be looking at, is this token still alive and has it been properly signed by that key? Additionally, a second technique you might use if you want is if you assume that man in the middle is going to break that first layer of encryption, the TLS-based encryption, then can I go ahead and have a secret inside my app which could be used to encrypt the API messages themselves, or at least to sign them for consistency to make sure they haven't been tampered with? So let's assume that we're going to go ahead and encrypt the API messages. In this case, let's assume that we are able to unpin a well-protected app. I can therefore remove the lowest level of encryption, and what I'll be able to see now is not the raw information going across, but I'll see an encrypted version of this. So you can layer encryption on. It's more expensive, but it does add more defense in depth kind of capabilities. Next slide. So now let's talk about some of those learnings of sort of a classical kind of approach, and what can we do to sort of build and evolve on this. So if you look at what we saw, one of the things that I liked was the fact that Tofu, Trust on First Use, goes ahead and does not hard code a secret in the app. What it does instead is, on first launch, it asks for a secret or something it can use to calculate a secret based on that. So that's interesting because it gets it out of the app for starters. Secondly, in the attestation space, I like the fact that Play Integrity actually evaluates the verdict off the app itself. So it's interesting to me to think about splitting security into measurements and decisions. And doing decisions off the app would seem to have some interesting advantages. Lastly, I like the fact that JWTs are not directly exposing secrets in the channel. So I'd advise not to use simple API keys, which of course are obviously very popular, but to try and add a little bit more protection there so that when those kind of tokens are exposed, you haven't lost the secret itself. So you can extend the lifetime of the secret there by making sure it's not directly exposed. On the downside here, Tofu requires that I really trust that first request for secrets. And if I'm an attacker and I'm just looking at getting your app, putting it on my device, and I'm man in the middle of it so I can observe everything, I can watch that request occur. So in its raw form, Tofu definitely requires quite a bit of trust. The second thing, in a sort of an arms race kind of way, the more capabilities I add, the more the app itself needs to be modified and potentially completely downloaded. So you may be putting out frequent version upgrades to your application across your entire installed base, which would be very painful. And these attacks evolve, so those code updates are definitely going to occur. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to look at where I'm at, and I'm going to propose that I would like to get secrets off the device. I like Tofu a lot in that sense. So I want no secrets ever to be at rest inside my device. No static secrets in code, no secrets stored in storage. That's a good design goal. Second thing I want to do is I like that split between measurement and decision making. So I'm going to want to minimize the amount of security and functionality I have in the app. Less functionality in the app means there's less stuff to hide, so I can consider hiding it as effectively and harden this as effectively as I can. So I'm going to definitely advocate measuring on the app and making decisions off the app. And the third thing I'm going to stretch to, which I think is important to API providers, is that if I can get secrets off the app, so they're only in the runtime and never at rest, then potentially I can very easily make updates to those secrets by simply updating them in the cloud somewhere. And additionally, I can maybe potentially make security enhancements in terms of decision-making capabilities by updating live that way also. Next slide. So here's a proposed architecture. So we have an application. It's the same Foodie application I was using at the beginning, communicating to a backend. And I'm going to split the measurement taking capabilities and the decision-making capabilities between an SDK, which will be doing the measurements, and a backend application auth service, which will be doing the evaluation of the attestations and making a decision, does this runtime appear to be safe to me? There's one secret here. This is the $4 signs that are here up in the service. And because I control that secret, I can change that at any time I want. So your Ops Center could frequently change the secret for some reason if it wanted to. So the application itself, before it makes an API call, would make a request to the SDK and say, I'd like a token, please. The SDK would provide some measurements up to the app authentication service. The app authentication service will process those measurements, make a decision, and that decision, that verdict, will be reflected in an token, an approving token there, the one in the green A there, that will be passed back to the SDK. And rather than an API key, now that API token, or that attestation token, I'm sorry, would be added into a header, let's say, and passed across, and the backend would go ahead and evaluate that token. And this architecture should look somewhat familiar to you because it's very similar to user authentication and how users are authenticated. Here we're talking about actually authenticating the application and its runtime environment itself. Next slide. So if you want to make a first-party API call, doing this, we've pretty much gone through it already. You make the API call, it goes up to the Approov service, the measurements are evaluated, a decision is made, a token is presented back that's added to your API call, and your backend will go ahead and validate yes or no. On the reverse, if there has been some sort of bad thing going on, so the runtime is not healthy, what occurs in this case is the measurements come up, the app authentication service will make a decision. In this case, it will say, this is not a healthy application, so I'm going to return a token to you, but it will have something wrong with it. So it's probably not going to be signed with those $4 signs. That will again get passed. Your backend will make a decision and say, this is no good. So changing the signing secret, we've already sort of mentioned that as well. The ops team can change their secret at any time when they want. So each app's attestation will be signed immediately with the new secret. So as soon as an app requests to be attested, Ted, if you go to the next slide, you'll see we've changed from $4 signs to €4. So the token will be again signed in this case. Now, if you're looking at making a third-party API call, so let's say you do not have the luxury of controlling your own backend. Let's just assume that the third party is using a static API key. In this case, when the SDK makes a measurement and asks to be a decision to be made by a testing service, the service will check, and if it decides that the application is healthy, in addition to providing the authorization token, it will go ahead and also provide to you the current API key for that backend service that or third-party service that you're trying to use. So instead of actually sending the JWT token, in this case, the SDK would add the API key for that service. And you can put most of the machinery for augmenting, intercepting, and modifying the networking stack inside the SDK space itself. Next slide, Ted. So I guess I did forget to mention there that changing the API key is as easy as it was for changing the secret. The ops team here can go ahead and change an API key. Let's say you don't control this API and the service was compromised somewhere else, and all of a sudden you're told, here's a new API key you have to use. Rather than having to roll that out statically inside a new application, your ops team can go ahead and make a change to that API key by just making a script call or clicking a web box and typing in that new API key, and it'll immediately get picked up by the next attestation request from any one of those apps. Okay, next slide. So certificate pinning itself, we talked about It's very similar here. We said it was not a secret in the sense that it would be okay if it was exposed, just not if it was changed. And one of the knocks on certificate pinning, why it's somewhat difficult to use in the mobile world, is the danger that if the certificate itself expires, how do you update it? How do you actually make a call back to get something new? With attestation flows in place, now we have that same way to establish trust through that measurement decision-making process. And if trust is established, then very similar to providing an API key, we can provide a new certificate hash or fingerprint back to the device. So this enables management of certificate pinning to be far more palatable because it's live, just like any other secret or constant. You can go ahead and pass that once trust has been established with the Appice service. And again, as soon as the next attestation occurs, then immediately a new pin can be used. And you can preload new pins if you want. You can keep a battery of pins here. You can rotate pins. It's all enabled by now the fact that we have the ability to dynamically change these secrets and values on the fly. Signing message, same story. It's kind of boring to say the same thing over and over again, but if you establish trust, then you can go ahead and add a new decryption key into this. So again, if a decryption is somehow broken, you can change this on the fly. The only thing I would add to this is that it's often very helpful to bury as much of the rewriting logic and the encryption itself into the SDK itself, just so you don't actually try and read that decryption key, roll your own stuff, and put that in storage by mistake somehow. You don't want to do that. So by putting as much of the machinery, both for the networking stack and any additional security layers you want in the SDK, everything's kept clean, and it's a little bit harder for a developer to accidentally make a mistake. Next slide. So I've already said one of the major advancements, I think, in using an architecture like this is that you have the ability to live update your security. So your ops team can actually change keys, change certificate pins, change secrets they want anywhere on the fly. Additionally, they can change the security posture. Before, because the security is being made on the app itself, you would have to sort of embed whether you were checking for a debugger or not, whether you're checking for routing or not, and that would be embedded in the application. When you have the decision being made off the device, now changing the posture, whether you accept a debugger or not, whether you accept rooting or jailbreaking or not, is again a policy that is decided in the cloud and not on the application itself. So you could roll out your application saying, I don't want to lose any customers and I want to allow rooting. And then later on, you could tighten your security and say, I'm a little concerned about what I'm seeing here in the traffic. Additionally, because these measurements are being made on device and passed up to a service that is off device, now we have access to all that information that's going on there. So if you look on the right here, you'll see the measurements that are flowing. In the upper one, different versions of an application with passing. And you can see this particular application is using more during the day than it is at night. And then 2 orders of magnitude lower, you're seeing in the lower screen failures where the attestation has gone and detected something is wrong. And you can actually look at the data and gather a lot of interesting forensics by looking at what are the reasons why these are failing. Are they concentrated at particular times and so on, and coming from particular locations. So you're still getting full measurements reported, and you make those kind of decisions. The last thing to add here, just real quick, is that though you can't actually sort of update your application on the fly, you can add new data to it. So you do have the ability to add minor security enhancements by telling it to take a different set of measurements or a different signature pattern or a memory pattern to look for. Next slide, Ted. So just to wrap up on the next slide for me, if you look at the OWASP Mobile Application Security Verification Standard, which is quite thorough, the last section of that, the resilience section, is kind of the most interesting. And have we made these apps more resilient by doing this splitting of measurement and decision making? along with all the other enhancements. And if you look at the different sections, does it impede dynamic analysis and tampering? Is it stealthy? It's an interesting term they use in here. And the answer is yes. By splitting these things, you have more stuff off app. And if you are trying to attack something on an app that you could control, on a device you control, that's easy. If you have to actually get behind the attestation firewall and somehow intercept and break that decision off the device, that's really hard. So you have definitely enhanced your security there. Device binding we didn't talk about, but as part of an attestation process, you will have the ability to uniquely identify individual devices. So you can bind things to a device. So you could, for instance, bind an attestation decision to a user authentication decision. So you could have sort of a hybrid token or bound tokens together, so that you have to have both and they must match in order to get across. So you've enhanced your device-specific security there. Does this impact the comprehension of the device? Well, the fact that the SDK is the only thing that's really being added here means you can focus all your resources on custom obfuscation and really hardening that particular SDK footprint. Lastly, does it impede eavesdropping? And by making certificate pinning and message encryption far more dynamic, where you can change secrets, change certificates on the fly, then I would argue that yes, you've made the bar for using certificate pinning and encryption much lower, so therefore they'll be used more frequently, and therefore eavesdropping will be impeded. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ted at this point.
Thank you, Skip. And you are almost pinpoint on your timing. So we have a couple minutes left to just kind of wrap it up. So thank you, Skip, for going through the attack, defend exercise there. I think just to kind of close things out, I just want to reiterate, that the need to defend is very, very high right now. And again, I'm kind of preaching to the choir with the audience we have today. But coming back to the API secrets that have been exposed, 23% in critical fintech apps right away. The first line of defense that Skip talked about was code obfuscation. Pretty ineffective. It reminds us of the old story about, can you outrun the bear? And the answer being, I can't outrun the bear, but I can outrun you. Obfuscation is a tactic that I think, if somebody's not obfuscating, you'd hope that maybe it would slow them down, slow the pursuit down. They'd go after lower hanging fruit, but not really the case today. Apps with obfuscation were 93% ineffective, and apps without obfuscation, 96%. So not much of an advantage there. The other thing that I wanted to point out, which I did not mention earlier, but in the report that we did, we looked at the usage of TLS certificate pinning to stop those man-in-the-middle attacks. And what we found was only 4% of the fintech apps were using certificate pinning. Partially probably because of the risk of possibly bricking the app if the certificate expires and the pain of kind of updates. So I appreciate the fact that we addressed that in the solution provided. So vulnerabilities again exist both at rest and at runtime, and so another way of looking at this, and I think in the comments section we already had somebody jump to the conclusion on app authorization as a service. Like user authorization, this is really just an app authorization as a service. So we've removed the secrets from inside the application itself, migrated it to the cloud, to a secure space. We've minimized the security vulnerabilities in the app by, again, splitting the measurements and moving some of the security to the cloud and some of it to the app. So getting the verdicts off the app makes it more maintainable, makes the ability to react to 0 days and other things, other threats more feasible. And in addition to that, we've also provided the ability to do live updates to both the secrets policy and the security policy. So you can update your measurements, you can update your secrets, you can update your certificates. You can update your encryption. So, and lastly, we have the ability to kind of provide the live telemetry data and the forensic data so that you can in real time monitor what attacks you're seeing, what are the methodology that's most common, and is it shifting and is it evolving over time using the forensics capabilities. So that covers us. I think Alyssa will be happy. We're maybe 4 minutes over the hour. So that leaves us about 10 minutes. If there's Q&A, here she is. Welcome
yeah. So a few things. For those of you who have not read it, shameless self-plug here. Go download the Playing with Fire white paper. I think over the last 23 years, it was probably the most fascinating research I had ever been involved in hacking Fire APIs in healthcare. And I do want to, I think Approov is still hosting it. Skip, remind me, I can't believe it's been 4 years. Feels.
Has it been that long?
Skip, you haven't aged. I've aged. You haven't aged. I don't know what's going on. But
I don't know, Alyssa. It looks like you have more purple hair than I do.
Yeah. For those of you who are interested, Graham Grieve, the creator of the Fire Standard from Health Level 7, and John Murphy, the head of Cybersecurity Committee Chair, is speaking at the conference. They're both speaking tomorrow. This was the first research I had ever published that actually affected public policy. And several congressmen actually held the Approov white paper up that I wrote on Capitol Hill. And so I urge all of you to read it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's on our website, Alyssa, and I can tell you that we monitor downloads and visits and look at that, and we see it every week. Lots of people are. I mean, it's still very, very current. The research that you did. But, yeah.
Okay,
it's still on the bestseller list. So
okay, cool.
And it's also used a lot at universities. We see a lot of us students really relying on that paper, that white paper, as an authority document on the Fire, API. So.
Well, on the red track here, we see a lot of presentations on how to break stuff, and I loved in your presentation how you guys focus both on this is how the attackers are doing it, and this is what we found with our empirical data, and then, oh, by the way, this is how you can solve for that. So I really appreciated that. Developers have to hard code secrets into their apps. Why is it that in 2023 developers are still doing this without obfuscation? Like, I mean, just brutal honesty. You're with friends right now. Like, what? Well, at least one. What do you think is the cause of this? I mean, it's 2023. Companies are still not certificate pinning their apps. They're still hard coding secrets without obfuscation. Like, what is going on?
So obfuscation and certificate pinning, I would answer differently. Obfuscation, if you're not doing sort of the basic free obfuscation, you're being lazy, I think.
Yeah.
And,
because you can even implement it for free, right? Like, you don't even have to pay.
Yeah, as I said, R8 is provided by Google inside Android in Android Studio. It's like one line of code to add into your build. It's not there by default, and maybe it should be, but it's not hard. And I would bet some people just don't even know about it. It's
just ignorance or laziness.
Yeah. Now, I think obfuscation is just sort of table stakes. You got to have it to get started.
I just can't believe that. Well, I just really can't believe that risk outweighs the benefits here. I just can't, I don't know.
I don't think someone could convince you that their argument to not use obfuscation is correct. Anyway,
I guess I should say the benefits outweigh the risk, but it's, I don't know. It's just sad because even like that was 4 years ago, right? Now today, 4 years later, you guys have proven the companies are still doing this, and even with free available tools, like let's say they didn't have the budget at all, I mean, just the fact that they're still not doing it even with free tools. Now, one of the questions that came in was about things like Frida. You know, so is it possible? Is it even possible for an app to detect if an attacker is attempting to bypass certificate pinning with something like Frida? So, like, if they're using Frida, is it even possible to detect something like that?
The short answer is yes, and I'll let Skip go into the details of how. I'll let him do the heavy lifting.
That was it. So, so there are multiple levels. So it's a definite cat and mouse game. So can Frida be detected? Absolutely. It's often not able to be used at full power unless a device is rooted or jailbroken. So there's, for starters, root and jailbreak text. Then you can specifically look for actions and signatures that indicate that Frida is in operation. So you can do those kind of runtime checks. People keep trying to find new ways to hide them. So as I said, it's a cat and mouse game, which makes that security updating live kind of pretty important, because you want to be able to very quickly react and evolve with the attackers, unfortunately.
So one of the other questions that came in is, in your research, did you further decompose the apps down by Android versus iOS apps? So I think when your slide showed like the breakdown of geography, but it didn't seem like there was operating system platform. Did you guys specifically target Android? Or
it's a great question, and the answer is that the report that we looked at was exclusive to Android, and the follow-up, one of the things that we're looking at as a follow-up is to look at iOS apps and do a comparison between the two. But we also have a long list of other things that we want to do. So we're looking at kind of, we want to put these reports out on a quarterly basis, and we want to look at apps in other industries. So we want to pivot to things like healthcare and look at the healthcare apps compared to the fintech apps. And then we want to pivot to different regions and see if we see more regional differences in the Middle East or Africa or Asia Pacific region. And also the OS pivot of looking at, iOS apps compared to Android apps. But I mean, I'd like your opinion on that one. Do you think it's going to be substantively different? I don't think it will. I mean, I think it might be a slightly higher level of security, but I don't think we're going to see a dramatic improvement.
I think, and feel free, anyone in the audience, to contradict me, but I feel like, especially with Dr. Katie Paxton Fear, I don't know if you or Skip saw her presentation this morning, her keynote this morning, but she tends to find more vulnerabilities on the iOS side. So I get the feeling, even when I was doing the research with you guys 4 years ago and 3 years ago, we did heavily focus on Android, but I think that's probably a result of just my laziness. But I feel like there's a false sense of security, with iOS, where people feel like, oh, it's iOS, it's going to be a lot more secure than Android. And so there's a tendency, I think, to kind of, just push it off over there to the side and focus more on Android, focus more resources and effort on Android. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see the follow-up research on that, because I think it's a really good point. And, I think there is a big misperception out there about that, we have a tendency to think Android's just more vulnerable.
Yeah, and her talk is going to be online, because I think we were tied up in a meeting this morning and prepping for this, so we missed it. I take it we can access all of the.
Yeah, we're gonna. For those of you who just joined us as well, we will be posting the talks from all these presentations on our website. They'll be freely available. You won't need to buy a virtual pass or anything. Looks like another question.
So I did want to just comment on Android Android versus iOS. At the risk of getting canned for being promotional, we do support both Android and iOS. And one thing that's important to us is that we make the developers SDK look the same. So it's a similar process.
It's pretty much,
by supporting both, we do see activity there. And I would say probably the reason Android gets more looks is that it's easier to see into.
It's the redheaded.
It's more open, and it's yeah.
So so one of the questions that says, why do you guys think the U.S. fared so poorly in your research?
Oh, I think it did not surprise me at all. We move fast and break things, I mean, it's just, there is
It's
a
American way, right?
it is
Ready,
it
fire,
is the
aim.
VC community. It is the American, you know, everybody is being pushed to get things out and to fix it later. You know, having spent a lot of time in Europe, you know, and you know, I mean, Alyssa, you've dealt with the European sensibilities are just different. You know, there is a more cautious approach to security. Now, it's not night and day, and that, you know, that night being
No
pun intended. It is not that different, but there is a more conscientious development philosophy within European companies. They're not in such a rush to get the apps out quickly. You know, we have a culture that is first to market wins, and we're not gonna be behind our competitor. So we're gonna push this thing out, and then we'll fix it later. And a lot of times those things never get fixed. They never circle around to it. So,
well, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read it yet, my favorite finding, and I think, oh, by the way, hi, John Murky has been watching this presentation. He says hi. But, you know, for those of you who have not read Playing with Fire yet, my favorite finding, I think, in that was when I logged into a Fire API and the developer decided to send all of the data in the database, all of the patient records, and relied on the mobile app to filter out the results for the logged in user. So, I mean, I think, yeah, it's great. I think I agree. Ted, you know, I'm sure you're getting at this was, you know, I just think that's going to be a timeless piece. I just don't see that going out, you know, out of vogue anytime soon. But it's yeah. So for those of you who haven't read it, definitely check it out. So Ted, Skip, we're at time. I appreciate both of you. This was an awesome presentation. We got a lot. You guys got a lot of compliments on the chat as well. So great job, and thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to having you in the next conference.
excellent. Thank you,
Thanks,
Alyssa. Thank you
Alyssa.
for having us. It was great to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Hopefully next time it's live.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Ted.
Excellent.